I've got roughly 25, nearly 30 years experience doing landscape in various capacities here in the Albuquerque area. And I'm just going to jump right into the slides. That is, if it's okay. So before I get into the actual system, wanted to talk a little bit about the basics of tree watering. So as a former arborist, understanding trees has been really key to the work that I've done consistently as a community planner for Anthropopulous Design and Planning. We do tree inventories in rural communities here in New Mexico, as well as areas like downtown Albuquerque, helping the city do inventories. So really wanted to dive into making sure that there's a basic understanding of how trees work and how watering works well. So on the top left of the screen, you'll see a perennial shrub, and a tree, and those are kind of accurate images of what root systems look like. So with trees, it is often a misconception that trees send down tap roots and that they can reach the aquifer. I've had folks tell me that they live up near tramway and they don't need to water their tree because it's able to hit the aquifer. And at that point, the aquifer is at least 250 feet deep. And so it is very unlikely. The way trees actually work is all the structural roots that you see in that left image, that top left image, help keep the tree supported. Majority of structural roots only reach down about 3 feet. And majority of the feeding roots, which are very thin filament roots, extend out and sit no deeper than 2 feet, often as shallow as 8 to 10 inches across a very wide area. So kind of a good rule of thumb if you're thinking about where the root zone is on your tree is if you took your tree and laid it over on its side and then spun it in a circle, that's kind of the extent of majority of the feeder roots. So oftentimes when we talk about where to water trees, we'll talk about going along the drip line, which is that edge of the canopy. So pretty much, let me see if I can get a pointer. I can't. So on the top right, you'll see the little jagged, roughly edge with blue dots. That represents the drip line, and that represents areas that if you were using point source drip, like the little flag or button emitters that are fairly popular in residential areas for drip, that's the area that is recommended to water. And the reason that area, or the dashed line in that bottom left, is the way that water interacts with our soils causes it to spread out some. And so if you're consistently watering along that drip line, you're going to get water interior of that where the feeder roots start. So from the drip line to the trunk, feeder roots usually start about halfway out. So if you've got a 6 foot between the trunk and the drip line, about 3 feet out from the trunk is where you'd want to start watering, to at least 3 feet past the drip line. And that way you can ensure that feeder roots and the large bulk of feeder roots are getting the water that they need and are able to get the nutrients. So another basic of tree watering is understanding soil and water interaction. Depending on where you live in Albuquerque or the Albuquerque metro area, you're going to have different soil types. Our most common is sandy loam, which acts kind of in between the two images that you see on the left. So in really sandy soils, like you see along the west side, water will basically travel straight down fairly quickly. So those illustrate a specific amount of water put down and how quickly it travels to specific depths. So let's say if you drop a gallon of water into really sandy soils, within 15 minutes, most of the time it hits 12 inches. Um, and some of it will retain there, whereas some of that goes further. Within 24 hours, majority of the water will have spread out down to a depth of 72 inches. Whereas if you do the same gallon of water in clay, it may take 24 hour or 20, I can't talk. To go 24 inches, it may take 4 hours. So it may take 2 hours to get down 12 inches. And that's because of the way the clay soils dissipate the amount of air. So heavier soils, silty and clay soils, usually hold water for a longer period of time, but also don't allow it to travel as quickly. Also, sandy soils tend to have water travel vertically much more consistently than it travels horizontally, whereas clay soils have a tendency and silty soils have a tendency to have water travel horizontally. And the reason that's important to understand is if you live on the west side and you water for 4 hours twice a week, you may not you may be pushing water much deeper than trees have capacity to reach. And it's also kind of a misnomer that all trees will adjust their root depth to reach water. Some trees have that ability, other trees don't. Native trees or desert adapted trees like a desert willow have much more of a tendency to seek out water. Something like an ash tree, which is native to areas where it's wet, they're considered a bottomland tree. And their natural habitat tends to be moist areas. Their roots really have not evolved to seek out water because water is there where they evolved. And so understanding that in sandy soils, you're going to need to water more often, but for a shorter amount of time to keep the water where you need it. And then with clay soils, even in the summer, if you've got a fairly drought adapted tree, you may only need to water once a week, maybe even every other week if it's a really drought adapted tree such as mesquite or desert willow. And you would need to water for a longer amount of time every time. So one tree in sandy soils on the west side, you may water 3 or 4 times in a week during the height of summer, but for a shorter amount of time, say 25 to 45 minutes. Whereas if you're in the heights and you've got rocky soil with a bunch of clay and silt mixed in, you may only water once a week. And so when we worked on that irrigation guide that Kenny talked about, all of the illustrations you see on this slide come from that guide. We provided ways for you to test what your soil does and how it reacts. Jar test gives you a pretty basic idea. The percolation test, which is there on the right, gives you a much better idea of how it's going to work when you're watering trees. So just having a basic understanding of when you do water, what it's going to do in your soil is really important to accurately scheduling and not wasting water. So we'll move on to the next slide. So 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, the Water Authority and Bernalillo County approached us to develop some educational materials on how to really efficiently and as inexpensively as possible develop a system that works for watering trees well. So one of the things that has occurred with the Water Authority's conservation methods and programs is over time we've had a decline in tree canopy, and some of that is because when folks do these major conversions, they don't always consider the trees, and there's been more concentration on grass removal. And oftentimes trees that have grown in a grass area for years and years and years, when the grass is removed, if there wasn't enough irrigation installed to replace that and to keep the tree healthy. We've had canopy dieback. The other thing is the last major canopy efforts that occurred are nearly 40 or 50 years old here in town. So much of the Northeast Heights was developed in the 80s and 90s. West Side has some newer canopy, but oftentimes trees were not chosen for those developments that are really good for heavy clay soils, which do exist in parts of the West Side, or the super sandy soils that exist in other parts. And so we've had quite a bit of canopy dieback. And as efforts like Tree New Mexico's efforts for re-upping or reintroducing canopy into the city, there was this growing concern that folks, once a tree was planted, folks weren't going to be able to water it consistently, which trees appreciate consistent watering. And so we looked at what are the best ways. Right now, in the Albuquerque metro area, if you have an in-ground irrigation system and you want to add another zone, so an automated valve attached to a controller and the PVC or PEX piping that would go along with that, normally that pricing starts around $800 and up to $1,800, depending on who you hire and the extent that they have to do the work. And for a lot of people, that is out of a price range that works. And so we really wanted to develop a system that would only cost maybe a couple $100 at most, and that would provide the appropriate watering specifically for trees, but it could be used for underplantings as well. So the initial client that we took on was the county. So you'll notice that most of the slides and the booklet that we'll provide a link to at the end of the slideshow, it's all in county colors, but it was done with the Water Authority as well. And now this material is available across the state, and it's part of the Tree Alliance. So there is a New Mexico Tree Alliance that is a coalition of nonprofits and municipal groups and pseudo-governmental groups that are really working to provide consistent educational materials for the whole state. And so this has been adopted as part of the Tree Alliance's shared educational materials. We did want to make sure that it was offered in English and in Spanish. So there are both. And the main purpose of this presentation is to kind of walk through the slides. So you're going to see some really, or not the slides, the pages of the booklet. It's only 4 pages. You're going to see some fairly busy, dense slides, and then we'll jump to which represent one of the pages, and then we'll jump to some more specifics. So as we go through, make sure you put questions in the Q&A if you've got them, and those will get back to me, or through the Water Authority Ask an Expert, we'll figure out how to answer those. And then make sure that at the end you jot down the links to the PDF themselves. So page 1, which you see there on the right, shows all the parts that you would need to purchase, kind of gives you a tool list, and then at the bottom it's got the small, medium, and large tree. So one of the things to keep in mind when you're developing or building out the system at your home, or commercial, if you're doing it in a commercial setting, is the amount of water that you're going to be applying is going to depend on the amount of trees. So small tree normally is considered about 8 foot across. So the average male adult American's wingspan, when you stick your arms out from tip to tip, is usually about 6 feet. So if you walk up to your tree and you stick your arms out and it's twice as wide as your arms are, then you've actually got a medium tree. So majority of the street trees and majority of residential trees that are ashes, pistaches, oaks, some of our common street trees that end up in front yards, um, unless it's a mulberry, majority of the time the trees you're looking at are going to be medium size. So if you have a mulberry, or you've got a cottonwood, or you've got a larger Japanese pagoda, or a large Kentucky coffee tree, um, those end up being that much larger size. And so later on in the presentation, we'll give some rules of thumb for how much water each of those sizes kind of get, um, and how you would set it up. So again, realizing that this is a daunting first page, we'll break it down a little bit more for you. So I'll go back in that tool list. It talks about a trenching shovel, polytubing, cutter or a PVC cutter, polytube punch, and then a small sledgehammer. This slide breaks down what those are. So on the left, you're going to see a trenching shovel, which is really important to if you are going to put your poly just into the very low, like the surface of your yard, you're going to want a trenching shovel. They're not terribly expensive. This system works even if you don't trench. Because we have such harsh UV in Albuquerque Metro, you'll want to make sure that if you're leaving it on the surface that you put a mulch above it. Our recommendation is shredded wood mulch, and I'll get into that a little later as well. PVC cutters come in various um, styles. Those are next to the shovel on the top right. You've got a ratchet style PVC cutter, which is great if you don't have a lot of hand strength. That middle one is the most common. Often it's black. My preference is to buy the orange ones because when you set it down, it's a lot harder to lose. And I have lost many a garden tool because they blend right in. And then the one below it is a specialty tool. That one's going to run about $20, maybe even more. The one nice thing about it, you can see that it's got a weird nose and a weird little thing on the handle. The weird nose actually is a punch. And then the weird thing on the handle holds pieces. So you'll notice on the bottom left, there's 3 different styles of punches. And on that yellow one, you'll notice that there's a hex area. That's not to undo knots, or not knots, nuts in a system. That's actually the correct size to hold mini irrigation parts. So you can punch your hole into the poly tubing, and I'll show you some poly tubing here in a minute. So you can punch a hole, flip it around, add your irrigation piece, and then push that in. Particularly if you are working in the winter, it's important to have that or to carry around a small pair of needle nose pliers so you can do it, because otherwise you'll end up, you're pushing the two together and it'll tear up your hands. And over time, like 30 years worth, you end up with arthritis in your left hand from doing that. So my preferred punch is that orange one. Again, it's bright orange. It's almost impossible to lose. And it's got a really nice punch. The problem with it is it's got a really nice punch. And if you're not wearing gloves and you're not paying a lot of attention, that metal spike will go directly into the palm of your hand. So if you're concerned about that, I would look at these other 2 type of punches. All of these can be bought online. We always recommend that you go to an irrigation supply store, someplace like Ewing, someplace like Wind Supply, Newmark, Cisco, even just sprinklers for things like that. Those are all local irrigation supply houses that are able to help homeowners and not just professionals. So 2 other tools, one very necessary, one is very much optional, Teflon tape, and then lawn staples, and that's what they're called. Um, the lawn staples are used to help hold the poly in place or the tubing in place, which is particularly good before you put mulch down. So making sure that you've got at least some of those tools or have access to borrow those tools for someone will make this job much easier. You can't really use scissors on poly. You can use pruners on poly, but you have to make sure that you're cutting really straight when you do so. So it's better to spend a little bit of money and get the correct tool to do it. So then we jump into the actual parts themselves, and I'm gonna make you dizzy by jumping back 2 slides really quickly. But that parts list that you see there, where it says short RV camper hose, every single part is named, and we developed this educational packet so that you could actually take this to either a big box store like Lowe's or Home Depot, your local hardware store like True Value or Ace, or an irrigation supply store. Again, that's our recommendation. And show them the list, and they can help you get all of the parts that you need. So fairly quickly, we'll go through. We do recommend having an RV hose or one of the short hoses attached to the hose bib itself. And part of that is so that it's easier for you to lift up. It also doesn't put stress on the connection to the controller, which is one place where we see leaks occur. We also do recommend that you get a Y splitter or a manifold with additional sockets on it, so that way you can still run a regular hose. The way this system works is once it's all attached, you turn on the hose bib and you leave it on. So the way you control water for the hose would be the little thumb valve on the Y splitter, and then you leave that thumb valve open to the controller. So the controller has its own valve that will only open when it is told to you by how you program it. Past that, number 4 is a backflow preventer. So by law, in the Albuquerque metro area and Bernalillo County, you have to have a backflow preventer on these devices. No one's going to come and inspect, but ethically you need to make sure that's there. So particularly if you add fertilizer or have dogs, you don't want to reintroduce E. coli or extra nitrogen back into our water source, because every time that controller shuts off, it creates a vacuum, which could pull those materials or components back into the water system. So by law, you have to have a backflow preventer. And the way inline backflow preventers work, if you attach that to your hose bib, it remains constantly under pressure and you'd have a fountain. So you have to put it after the controller. There's multiple controllers. So each of these hose systems is recommended to water roughly 3 or 4 mature sized trees, which is usually what's contained in a front yard, not necessarily in a backyard. So you may find that you want to build 2 of these systems for backyard trees. And so you may want a controller that's got more than one exit port. They make them where there's 4 or 5, all controlled by one hose bib controller. So after number 4, you see number 6, and number 6 is a pressure regulator. Pressure is really dependent across the city. I live near San Mateo and Constitution, and my house has between 100 and 80 psi. Irrigation systems with drip work best when the PSI is between 20 and 40. If you have PSI above 40, where it says that you only get a half gallon out of the emitter, you may end up getting 3 gallons out of the emitter because they're built to handle a specific amount of pressure. The other thing is end caps and stuff are developed for no more than 40 or 50 psi, consistently. And so if, like my house, you're trying to push 80 to 100 psi, you're potentially going to have broken parts and leaks on a regular basis. So making sure that you've got an inline pressure reducer or pressure regulator. They may look different than what you see there, and that's okay. Majority of them will always have printed on them or actually manufactured into them the PSI rating. So again, you want to go from anywhere from 25 to 40 for your PSI. It's fine if you get a 25 and attach that. The emitters will still work and be consistent. So number 7 is kind of an optional part. I do recommend it. It's a filter. And part of it is so we have fantastic water coming out of the hose bib, but there are times, particularly if you live in an older part of the city like I do, where your neighbor may have a leak under the road, or the connections between the main line in the streets and the meter have breaks. And if you ever drive down Carlisle, you'll see in front of many houses there'll be a asphalt patch. That's because the age of the infrastructure and there's been a break. And so mud and stones and stuff get introduced into the system. And so having a filter is great. If you're in a newer part of town, you may not feel like you need the filter, and that's okay too. After that is number 8 is a part that will screw onto the filter or the pressure reducer, and on the other end it's fitted for the poly. So there's 2 different size poly. My recommendation is 3/4 inch poly. It's polyethylene tubing. It's either going to be sold as a brown tube or a black tube. Most big box stores and hardware stores will sell a 1/2 inch version. The 1/2 inch, you are pretty much limited to 200 feet of length before you don't have enough pressure to correctly run, because the water will lose pressure as it goes through the tube. Whereas 3/4 inch will allow you to have further runs. So again, I recommend 3/4 inch, but if you are doing all your shopping at a hardware store or big box store, you may be limited to the 1/2 inch size. Also double check, and it's worth asking somebody at the store whether they know it's inside or outside diameter, because you want to make sure that the components that you buy match the type of tubing that you're getting. I recommend compression fittings, which you see there, but there are insert and clamp style. There's also shark's tooth, which are great, but they're a little more expensive. So finding something similar to what you see here. So number 9, and I realize there's 2 9s, but number 9 should be your flush cap. So there's multiple ways of ending a poly. We recommend the flush cap, and the reason we recommend it is as we get into winter, you can take the cap off and store it in a bag with the batteries from your timer, and then put those someplace, hang it on a hook, stick it on your back porch, someplace where you're going to find it in the spring. But that way you're winterizing. If you've got the figure 8 type closure for your pipe, you have to squidge out the end of the pipe and then open it up that way. So the way this whole system works is you're going to go from your poly, which is number 9 also in this, to number 10, which are connectors. And then we've got regular spaghetti line, which is a 1/4 inch polyethylene tubing. Common nomenclature is to call it spaghetti. And it does not have emitters in it. So it's what you'll go from the poly to the tree or too close to the tree, the drip line, and then you'll switch to number 11, which is an emitted line, and I'll show you a better picture of that here in a moment. But the emitted line has either every 6 inches or every 12 inches an emitter built into it. And you can't, so what you see here is the setup for small and medium trees. If you have a large mature tree, instead of using spaghetti and this 1/4 inch emitted line, you're going to use something called Netafin or inline emitted line that is either going to be 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch. So it'll be still with a connector. You'll attach to the poly, you'll run additional poly out to the drip line, and then you'll attach this larger pipe. So the larger pipe with the emitters built in is not very flexible. So we only recommend it for the larger or some larger medium-sized trees. If you're pushing that 18 or 20-foot wingspan on the tree canopy, you'll want to go with that 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch, and you build it out as a grid or as a loose spiral. But it kinks really easily. So for smaller trees, we don't recommend using it, and we recommend the 1/4 inch instead. And then on this slide, that last piece that you see as number 10, that is it's called a goof plug, but it essentially is an end cap for that 1/4 inch line. All right, so that was a lot of information. Again, that parts list on page 1 of the brochure will give you all the parts names, so you don't have to remember that. All right, so page 2, it's also very dense. Right here on the right-hand side, you've got a roll, and this is probably a 50-foot roll of the inline emitted line that's a 1/4 inch. And then you've got an emitter, and you can see that it's dripping. One of the ways that this line works is it's actually got, and to keep it from creating as much of a vacuum and pulling sand and stuff back into the emitter, it actually has holes on both sides of the pipe or on the tubing. And so you see that water droplet at the top of this emitter, and then it looks like it's a drop hanging that's moved down. That is potentially a drop from the second hole. Some brands put the 2 holes on the same side. Some brands have one, like in this picture, one hole would be on the left on the top and one hole would be on the bottom on the right. And so there's multiple brands. They are set up to be either every 6 inches or every 12 inches. If you're buying the Netafin or the large 1/2 or 3/4 inch poly with the emitters built into it, sometimes you can find spacing of 18 inches. For most people's use or for most situations, the 12-inch spacing works really well. And we'll get into that here in a sec when we talk in more detail about that tubing length that you see. But installation instructions, you always want to make sure that you're calling 811 before you dig. Teflon tape, you want to make sure before you start putting stuff together, you wrap all the male threaded parts with the Teflon tape. And that works to help seal, so you'll reduce the chance of leaks. Again, we recommend putting the 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch in trenches, just because UVs will diminish its lifespan. The 1/4 inch doesn't necessarily need to be in a trench, but if you're really feeling up for it, you can do that. Use the landscape staples. We do recommend that. And then cover the area with organic mulch. And again, we'll cover that a little more in depth. We have some pro tips or installation tips there, and go into a little more detail on this. So again, normally you're going to be looking at 1/2 gallon per hour or 1 gallon per hour emitters. Quarter inch is usually the half gallon per hour, and Netafin or the half inch 3/4 inch is most often 1 gallon per hour. Thing to keep in mind when you're looking at it, you may have picked up something that's in metric. Majority of these products were developed in Europe or in West Asia slash Israel. And so they may show up in metric instead of in English standard. You can always ask somebody, particularly if you're at an irrigation store, what size you're getting. So when we're figuring out how much to put down, we kind of do what we jokingly call backwards math to figure out the length that you need. So a large tree normally needs between 1,200 and 2,000 gallons per month during the height of summer. And the Water Authority's recommendations are 8 times a month. So if you are just getting into this and trying to figure out if you're going to be watering your tree enough, always start out with 8 times a month during the height of summer and roughly aim for 1,200 to 2,000 gallons, which seems like a lot, but it's not actually a huge amount. So let's say you've got a cottonwood, it's going to need on that higher end of 2,000 gallons. You're going to water it 8 times, so you divide the 2,000 gallons by 8, and you get 250 gallons per watering. Then you kind of come and go, okay, do I want to water for 45 minutes? Do I want to water for 90 minutes? Do I want to water for an hour? And you know, because you're using the Netafin, that you've got 12-inch spacing and you're going to be putting down 1 gallon per hour from every emitter. Then you go, well, I don't mind running it for 2 hours, make sure that it gets to where it needs to go for the roots. So you divide 250 gallons by 2 hours, or 120 minutes, and you get 125 gallons, which also then equates to feet, because you know that there's an emitter one every foot, and so you need 125 emitters. And that will give you an area, whether you make it squared out like a grid or do it as a large coil. As long as you have 125 feet with 125 feet emitters installed, you're going to be watering correctly. So if you've got a medium-sized tree that only needs 600 gallons, and you're still going to water the 8 times per month during the height of summer, you're going to look at 75 gallons per watering. And then because it's a decimal, because you just want to water for 45 minutes, you're going to multiply it. So you end up with 56.25, which then you round up to 113 because you bought the kind with half-gallon emitters. And so you'd need 113 feet of quarter-inch line, and easy to figure out. So that's how this breaks down. We also give this rule of thumb chart. So if you don't want to do the math and you want to make sure, when we developed these, we made sure that within your tree size, the medium tree, you weren't going to overwater excessively, nor would you underwater excessively. So you may be watering a little bit more than you would normally if you did the math, but it's not going to be so egregious that the Water Authority is going to be grumpy with you. You're also guaranteed, based off of this chart, using the sizing, to not underwater your tree, so you'll end up with a healthy tree. All right, so briefly it mentioned organic mulch for covering the piping, and we see 3 different images here. So you've got on the left a quick diagram that shows where you want to be watering. So again, you want to be watering in that drip line area between the green checked dot and the purple dot, I would actually recommend, because we are here in the desert, um, going out that same distance. So you see the distance between the purple and the green. You'd want to go that same distance out past the drip line, particularly on trees that are still growing. On a mature tree that's been there for 50 years, stopping at the drip line is adequate, but again, I'd probably go a little further. And it is okay to plant other plant material in that area, so you're not necessarily just watering the tree, but you're watering other perennials or shrubs as well. In the center there, you see some pines that have these circles. Um, Part of some of those mounds or the tree ring. Wow, my brain is not working. Some of the bark mulch rings there are installed correctly where there's a little divot closer to the trunk, like you see on the right. Some of them look like they have some of the volcano mulching. So when you are putting down a mulch ring, even if you're interplanting with other plant material, you want to make sure that you've got a little bit of space around the trunk where the mulch really isn't touching it. And that helps reduce potential insect damage and disease damage. All right, page 3 is also slightly overwhelming if you're not used to it. Basically, on this page, you're going to see watering frequency, and these are the Water Authority recommendations. We do recommend, particularly with as hot as our winters have been, to continue to water at least once a month, particularly if you have conifers or evergreens, because they continue to respirate and they don't actually go into dormancy. So it's really important that they get water. They evolve to have snowfall or rainfall, and if we don't get that, then they get additional stress. We do a little bit of myth busting on here because when I was with the Water Authority, and Kenny can probably vouch for this, you'll get people that say their tree is going to take too much water. And so we look at like a large cottonwood and the total annual needs for a large cottonwood compared to the same square footage of lawn. And you'll notice that the lawn, cool season lawn, which is what majority of folks want in a lawn, it requires more water and costs more. So, and it breaks down how that works. As part of the Tree Alliance, now that this is educational material for the Tree Alliance, you see all the different representatives there. When you get this as a PDF brochure, you get a QR code that takes you to that irrigation guide as well. The other thing is looking at the frequency, how that's determined. You've got a water needs, the water demand slope there on the left. And then you've got the notes or the addresses to be able to download it, the PDF in English or in Spanish. And that is my presentation. So again, if you've got questions, please either put them in the Q&A on the webinar now, and those can get back to me through the Water Authority. I did include my email address. I'm happy to answer a few questions that way as well. And I appreciate you guys attending.
Just a quick reminder, the hose and irrigation setup that Richard described today in today's presentation, that qualifies as part of the tree rebate program that we have. So you can receive up to 25% back or up to $100 as credit on your water bill if you are unaware of the tree bait program that we have here at the Water Authority.